Yeah, basically the book is made of a number of chapters. The first one, it's a chapter about the crisis of feudalism, and in particular is a chapter that looks at the reasons why capitalism developed, and which was fundamental, in my view, in order to understand what would be the modalities of the new structures and the new structures that capitalism had to implement. So I, in particular, was concerned with demystifying, rejecting the assumption that capitalism was a kind of evolution out of economic structures that had developed in the Middle Ages, and to show, in fact, that capitalism was a counter-revolution. The capitalism was the response to a whole set of social movements, a struggle. That was very important to me because it connected, it really gave me an insight, into the struggle that women had been making in the course of the struggle against feudal power. And therefore an insight as to why the attack, why capitalism, in a way, the development of capitalism had to start with this massive attack on women. This was for me one of the most exciting and satisfying researches, because it brought me in contact with the whole set of social movement that I knew vaguely of, like the heretic movement, from my early studies of European history, but I had no idea how important those movements had been, because the heretic movement were really movement of social struggle. They were movement against basically feudal power, but also the beginning of commercialization and of social relations. And I began to see also the role of women within this heretic movement, which was very strong. Women had a central presence in those movements. So this was important because, first of all, allowed me to see two things in terms of understanding capitalism. It allowed me to see, number one, that capitalism had come in response to a struggle, and in particular in response to the labor crisis, to the command over labor, the crisis of command over labor that this movement had produced. And therefore, not accidentally, capitalism was vitally interested in creating relations that would maximize the exploitation of labor. And second, that within this struggle, and women have played an important role, and the refusal of certain relation with men, and also a particular relation to procreation, had been important, had played an important role in this struggle. For example, the heretic movement gave women a certain status of parity with men, and also one movement that was critical with respect to women's subordination, but also the exclusion of women from the position of some power, for example, in the organization and administration of sacraments and so forth. So that too was important because it opened the possibility of understanding why this specific attack on women.
So that is basically the first chapter, right? Of the book.
The first chapter, yes, and the second chapter, it's a broad analysis of the main processes that constituted the transition to capitalism. In other words, it's a chapter that in a way tries to rethink the process of accumulation that Marx writes about at the end of Capital Volume 1, but rethinking from a different point of view. In fact, writing that history that Marx does not write, which is the history of primitive accumulation, from the point of view of the reproduction, the transformation in the reproduction of labor power, and also the transformation in the position of women. And so it looks at all set of processes that, for instance, it goes back, it re-examines the enclosures, the separation of workers from the land, right? But also examines not only the separation of workers from the land, but one of the key points in that analysis is that that's only the beginning, of the development of capitalism. The equally important was the separation of production and reproduction. In fact, this is one of the main themes of that second chapter, that what we have at the beginning of capitalism, in other words, capitalism begins not only with the divorcing of the peasantry from the land, which also takes place, by the way, in the New World, but begins with a separation, not physical, but in terms of social relation, of production from reproduction. That from an early stage, 16th, 17th century, you begin to see that there's a whole set of activities that begin to not appear any longer as economic activities. And in fact, and these are reproductive activities, and that these same activities are also now more and more naturalized and genderized and identified as women's work. So this is the center of this chapter, to show that when we speak of the precondition for the development of capitalism, we have to speak of a process that is much wider than Marx assumed, and that includes also the formation of a whole sphere of activity that is structurally devalued. And in fact, that devaluation is so structural that throughout all its transformation, capitalism has always reproduced that devaluation down to our day, which I think globalization, in fact, to the extent that globalization is a return of primitive accumulation, at the center of it you have that devaluation of reproductive activities. And then we have the third chapter. It's a chapter about the body, that looks at what happens to the body in the reorganization, capitalist reorganization of production and work. And the reason for that chapter is partially, again, to continue that history that Marx does not write. But partially is because to highlight the fact that capitalism has a very unique system, different, specific with respect to other forms of exploitation, in that it sees labor as the fundamental form of wealth, which is very important in terms of the type of disciplinary regime that it has to implement. So that the moment in which you see the labor is the fundamental forms of wealth, then there's a whole policy towards the body that has to be put into place, because then the body is this great field of resources that have to be maximized, they have to be developed. But of course, there's a dialectic of development and repression, and I'm very critical here of Foucault. Foucault always stresses the moment of development, that new productive capacities are developing, that we cannot write a history only from the point of view of repression. Very true, but repression is the first moment. You cannot have the development of new capacity in the body without the destruction of a whole set of forms of behavior, practices, beliefs that had been fundamental in the culture of pre-capitalist society, including medieval society in Europe. So the third chapter basically is a description of the different strategies that through the laws, through the transformation of the organization of everyday life, capitalism puts into place. And simultaneously also it is a description of how these transformations are then reflected in a mediated way in the discursive disciplinary field, the disciplinary field in terms of the disciplines. In other words, in the intellectual philosophical discussion of the time. For example, in the works of Descartes, in the works of Hobbes. So, for instance, it interprets it interprets Cartesianism, the rise of Cartesianism, you know, as a particular response to the class struggle, right? And as a response to the needs of the new discipline of work, you know, that demands a process of self-exploitation, self-management, and so forth. Then there is a fourth chapter on the witch hunts, and that is a long analysis of the witch hunts, how they took place, you know, what the witch hunt was in essence, in different countries, you know, with all due varieties depending on the particular countries. And then fundamentally it's an attempt to explain how the witch hunt relates to the broader attack on the proletariat and the broader process of primitive accumulation that was taking place in this period. And it looks at the different ways in which the witch hunt connects to these developments by looking at who were the witches from the point of view of their social status and what were the crimes they were accused of, and basically shows that there is a direct connection between the witchcraft charges and the process of land enclosure. There is also a relationship between witchcraft charges and trials and the attack and redefinition of women's sexuality, which is basically, in a sense, discipline towards its reproductive role, because one of the key tasks in this moment for capitalism is also to take control over women's reproductive capacities, so that the control of women's bodies, women's reproduction, biological reproduction, and women's sexuality are extremely important, both in terms of the new discipline of labor, but also in terms of actually using the female body as an instrument for the reproduction of the working class, the creation of a new generation of workers. And it shows, in fact, of how the witch hunt was functional to these goals. And here again, there is a polemic, if you want, with Marx and with Foucault, both of whom do not recognize the importance of this the importance of this event, which I see as fundamental to the formation of modern capitalist society. I mean, it's one of the great massacres that inaugurates, you know, the advent of modern capitalism. You have the slave trade, you have the conquest of the Americas, you have the persecution of the witches. So that is also in the last chapter, in a way, the last chapter takes, you know, some of the analysis of the first four to the New World, and in fact it shows that the persecution of witches is not purely European phenomena, but actually starting from the last part of the 16th century is exported to the so-called New World, and that in fact you have execution of witchcraft is broadly used by missionary and conquistadores, you know, both as a means of conquest, as a means of breaking down resistances, and specifically also to implement a new division of labor between women and men in the New World as well. And it looks at it particularly with reference to the Andes, and with reference also to the struggle the women in the Andes already in the 16th century mount against colonization and against the dominance of the priest, against the dominance of the new religion.